Hello, my name is Joel Kirk. I'm the artistic director and founder of Discovering Broadway. Welcome to today's interview with Erika Henningsen, who was the original leading lady in Tina Fey's musical Meangirls on Broadway, which opened in 2018. She started her Broadway career as Fantine in the 2015 Broadway revival of Les Miserables, and this fall you can catch her on Broadway in Flying Over Sunset. Erika Henningsen, thank you so much for joining us via Skype. We're so glad you're here, and congratulations on an incredible Broadway career, which is only just beginning.
I've been very, very lucky, but thank you very much.
So everybody wants to ask about Meangirls, so we'll start with those questions. Emily Urbanski is asking, how did you kind of find your own character in the musical compared to a movie when it is such an iconic film?
Trying to figure out how we were going to make the character different from the movie was sort of the battle for the whole out of town and previews, because with a movie you have the ability to do close-ups and you can do voiceovers, and we didn't have that. So we just thought, and we also had a massive Casey Nicholaw musical, because it's like once that show starts, it doesn't stop. So the character, because she's very much an observer, needed to jump off the stage a bit more than she needed to in the movie, where we could focus in on her. So for me, there was never any pressure put on me to do what Lindsay Lohan's character did in the movie, simply because I don't think it would have worked on stage.
Right.
But I figured out, and sort of working with Tina and working with Casey, the version of that girl needs to be theatricalized, and that meant somebody who was a bit more on the balls of her feet, a bit more eager, a bit more spunky, as opposed to like a chill, relaxed teenager. And there were a lot less, the way that I decided to have her manifest nerves or confusion was by saying too much or doing too much. As opposed to in the movie, she kind of sits back a little bit and watches, which was a learning process for me, because I will say sometimes I see videos or things, the little things we get tagged in from when we opened the show to when I left the show. And I think I performed everything at such a 10 right when it opened, which was not sustainable at all. And I learned that. And I was like, okay, there's a way to have this girl be spunky and on the balls of her feet and heart forward, but to not be manic, crazy energy, because that's not actually sustainable for doing a 3-hour show 8 times a week.
I find that most people don't realize Broadway actors are doing 8 shows a week with only 1 day off. But in addition to that, you guys are going on TV shows, you're making public appearances, performing at concerts, at award shows, at Tony Awards. And what's unique about Broadway is you're still performing 8 times a week while the nonstop press tour is going on, unlike major motion pictures or TV shows where you'll do all the filming on the set, you'll wrap, then you'll do all the press. You guys are always doing it simultaneously. And obviously certain events can give you adrenaline, right? Like leading up to the Tony Awards is a really exciting time, so I'm sure that gives you all this adrenaline. Leading up to Macy's Day, I'm sure that gives all this adrenaline right before the parade. But that's not sustainable long term. And sustainability is kind of the name of the game for Broadway athletes. So how do you take care of yourself?
Yeah, you kind of touched on it in just the way you asked the question of the idea that it is being an athlete. So every day is about preparing for the game that night. And, I grew up playing sports, but I wasn't incredible at them. But I'm really inspired by the way athletes, the way they eat, the way they rest, the way they recover is all about playing their game. When you're an actor, you play your game every day or sometimes twice a day. So it was a trial and error process. I think adrenaline got me through the first 6 months of the show. And then I completely crashed. I was losing my voice. My body was like not processing food well anymore because I just had so much stress and anxiety built up from doing the marathon every night. And that became a big turning point for me of, okay, how are we going to navigate through this? Because I want to keep doing this job for as long as possible. So it was a couple things. A huge thing that I'm a really big proponent of for young singers is speech therapy. Because I was losing my voice not because I wasn't singing properly, but because I wasn't talking properly. and I was yelling over the music because the whole show is underscored. When I would go to do press interviews, like you were talking about, when I would go to do events for the show that were loud galas where we had to sing and talk to people, that was also a moment where I was straining my voice. So I got into speech therapy, and truly within 2 weeks, like the way I sang and the way I talked totally changed. And it's why since then, I never had to call out of the show for vocal fatigue. I only called out for illness, but never for vocal fatigue, which was like a gift. And that's why if kids are struggling with their voice, I say obviously get it checked out, whatever, but look into speech therapy because that was the biggest help for me. And then it was the things that are athletic based, which was figuring out what foods to eat that would provide energy and what would take away energy. I made a lot of sacrifices with the people I saw or the places I would go to see them. And Gavin Creel has been one of my mentors for a very long time. And when people ask him that question, he says, obviously it's different for everybody, but for him, it breaks down to two things, which is just water and air, which is air is like aerobic exercise, moving your body, and water is like the simple thing of you have to be hydrated. Yeah, it sounds so dumb, but my dresser, Jess, on the show, she would follow me the whole show. And at the end of the show every night after I took my bow, I'd meet her backstage and I would chug like an entire thing of water because I just thought I just played my game. So I have to rehydrate so I can do it tomorrow. And that was something that we learned by trial and error as I started to get depleted and I started to lose electrolytes and energy. It was building it back up every day.
So what is in Erika's diet?
Yeah. Well, I'm very lucky right now because now it can kind of be anything. But for during Meangirls, there was not a ton of dairy. And that wasn't because of vocal stuff. That was more just how it affected my stomach. It was a lot of protein, a lot of greens, sweet potatoes. It's so boring. I really, and this is going to sound so terrible, but this is like the sacrifice that I think sometimes is needed. I would eat the same things every day. And I just thought there's no reason to, just because I want that cheesy mozzarella pizza, if I eat it before the show and my body reacts to it negatively or it makes me tired, it's not worth it. So that was a big thing for me. It's like berries, greens, clean protein, good carbs like brown rice, sweet potatoes, eggs, avocados. It was like kind of a rotation of that.
People on Broadway are like people training for a marathon, which I always think is interesting because everything you're eating, how much rest you're getting, all of that impacts your ability to perform. But surely you have to treat yourself, and like, of course, once a week, I'm sure you really want that mozzarella pizza. So do you treat yourself after the show the night before your day off?
I could eat something late at night if I wanted to. It meant I maybe wouldn't sleep as well, but there are nights where you want the mozzarella pizza and you gotta have it. I will say, Sunday nights, we had this incredible place that opened up across the street from us while we were opening the show. I would call them at intermission from the Sunday evening show, and I would say, I'm going to be at your restaurant at 7 p.m. Can you please have your margarita pizza ready for me? So that's the thing. I was like, you can't. I will say, like, there was a lot of sacrifice, but I also just knew I wanted to do the show for longer than a year, and that meant figuring out the balance. So I learned it was a lot of trial and error. Keeping a food journal was something I had to do, but it was worth it. And somebody like, I'm sure your kids are probably know what Adrienne Warren's doing in Tina. Like, she has a whole regimen that she abides by, but she's still able to live her life because you will drive yourself crazy if you think like, I can't have chocolate, I can't have cheese. You can. You just have to do it when you know your body can handle it.
I want our listeners to know that today's interview with Erika is brought to you by mozzarella pizza. Bad for sleep, good for the tummy.
Yes! I love that. I would love to be sponsored by mozzarella pizza. My dressing roommate, I roomed with Taylor and I roomed with Renee. Taylor could do whatever she wanted. Nothing really affected her. She was cool as a cucumber, easy to go. Renee, kind of like me, had to really plan things out, really keep track of things, because that's just how she felt in her best abilities to do the show.
I'd love for you to talk about self-advocacy, because a lot of people are anxious about putting themselves out there or asking for help. But obviously we have to believe in our abilities and our talent more than anybody else.
And to find the driven, appropriate way of doing it versus the desperate, hire me, please way of doing it. Can you talk about the difference between the two? Because I think they're right next to each other, drive and desperation. And people struggle in an anxious world to know the difference sometimes.
I think you're totally right. I think no matter how successful you get, you always feel like you're going to get found out or that you're going to overstep a boundary. Like, as much as I was playing the lead in Meangirls, that whole process, it was really hard for me to advocate sometimes for the storytelling of the character, because I just thought, who am I to question Tina Fey or Casey Nicola? And that's not because of anything they did to me. That was my own demons of like, your job is to show up and just say yes to everything, which that's not a bad quality. You should try everything once. But I will say that is something I'm really learning how to advocate for myself in a rehearsal room, because sometimes I don't trust my own instincts, or when there's all these other people watching me, I get nervous. I'm like, I'm just going to trust the director. In an audition room, I find I have a lot more freedom because it's my time. And I think for me, the biggest thing I've learned about advocating for yourself, for getting a job, for making connections, is it doesn't hurt to ask. Like, it really doesn't hurt to ask. And I don't mean that. My mom is so sweet. When I was auditioning for Meangirls, I had my final call back, and she was like, well, how did it go? I was like, I think it went okay. She said, but did you tell them you really want it? And I just thought, Mom, they know I want it. I showed up at 10 a.m. on a Friday to belt my face off. Like, they know I want it. But what it meant was, for example, I was working, doing a workshop with Tom Kitt at the same time. Tom Kitt was working with Nell Benjamin. Tom Kitt knew I was leaving on my lunch break to go to an audition. And I said, I don't know if you'll feel comfortable doing this, but I'm about to go sing for Nell. If you can put in a good word for me, I'd really appreciate it. And of course he did, because he and I had worked well together. He and I were close. He was close with Nell. And it didn't mean he wrote like a fancy recommendation letter. He just said, I heard you're seeing this girl. I'm working with her now. She's good. She's a good team player. It wasn't like, this is the most talented person ever. It was just like, I like this person. So for me, it becomes less about walking into the room and being like, I'm the only person for this job. This is the reason you need to give it to me. It's being a good person at every job you have and utilizing those contacts when it feels appropriate to vouch for you. And I think that gets, like you said, that comes from mentorships, that comes from building communities and not being afraid to reach out to those communities, because the worst they can do is say no. If you're handling yourself properly and doing good work, why wouldn't they advocate for you? Why wouldn't they say, oh yeah, I'll shoot that person a text, no problem. So for me, that's gotten easier to do because I've seen that it's worked in my favor, but it was really scary to do right when I moved to the city. But I became better at it by staying in contact with people, sending emails to people whenever they popped into my head of just like, I saw you're doing this. That looks awesome. I can't wait to see it. It's about building your network. It's having an awareness. And unfortunately, sometimes I don't know if that's something that can be taught, but it's having an awareness, for example, of like Flying Over Sunset. I did a workshop of it 5 years ago. When I saw that it was coming to Broadway, it was something, I didn't have anybody's email on that team, but I said, hey, I did this to my representation. Please tell them I'm interested.
Right. And this is another principle, I don't know if it resonates with you, which is it's never too early to connect with someone? In other words, especially if like the first time they connected with you, you were doing Theory of Relativity, which was great and huge and wonderful.
Yes.
But then by the time you circle back, you 2 years into Meangirls, like you said, the wall's gone. They're like, oh, she wants to come and audition for this? We're going to get her an audition for this. But it's because you reached out and you were able to actually show this like measurable career growth that it's... And everybody feels too early to the conversation to some degree. But again, time serves well people like you who are great people in the room. You, again, are advocating for yourself, but you're also putting in the work. It's not just that, you know, Tom says, hey, you should really take a look at her. Obviously, they called you in on that Friday morning for countless reasons.
At a certain point, like, word of mouth is only as good as your work is. Like, if you can't deliver... and that's what I mean. It's like if nobody's going to speak out on your behalf unless you're really doing a good job. So it's a two-handed game.
Sophie Miller is asking, as a younger actress, what were some of the really valuable lessons you learned in college when you were at Michigan?
Okay, so one is like I'll do one that's the personal one and one that's more of like the training thing. Personally, I think it's definitely happening in this younger generation of actors, because we have YouTube and because we have people that we like idolize, we tend to copy them. And I was obsessed with Carrie Butler and Sutton Foster, so I copied them. I had like no vocabulary for my own performing except whatever Sutton Foster did. I was like, well, that's good. Let me just do that. And yeah, that is good, but it's the best on her. It's not the best on me. Yeah. So that was something like, I don't remember which teacher said it to me, but he kind of called me out on, he was like, you're doing a performance of what you've seen as opposed to a performance of what you feel. And for me, I just was like, oh. And that's when I cautioned. I was like, it's great to have role models. It's great to like obsess about things and musical theater cast elements that you love. But at a certain point, if you're not cultivating your own artistic identity, then you're doing such a detriment to yourself. So that was like my personal thing. On a technical, educational level, having an understanding of style and history of this art form is so important. And that goes not just for musical theater, but like so much of music now is pop music and pop rock infused. So having an understanding of the way, like what was music like in the 60s, what was music like in the 70s, the 80s, because almost every single show I've auditioned for since I moved to the city has asked me not for a contemporary musical theater song. They've said, can you sing a song from the Golden Age? Or can you sing a pop rock song from the 60s or 70s? So as much as I love Meangirls, as much as I love Dear Evan Hansen, that's not a musical theater education, because those are the shows that are happening right now. But when I went in for Meangirls, I sang a Rolling Stones song because they said, sing a pop song that you think your character would know.
Oh, what did you sing?
I sang Ruby Tuesday because I thought Katie Heron probably only knows music that her parents listen to. Her parents are weird hippies. They probably listen to like Bob Dylan and the Stones. So I sang a Rolling Stones song.
What is in the Erika Henningsen songbook? What songs do you pull out that best feature you and your voice and your talent?
This is what I like love about my education, that we had to do this thing called a decade chart, where we had to have songs from every decade from 1900 to the 20s, 2000s. Because every time I get an audition, it's like, sing a 50s doo-wop song. I have that in my book. So that's what I mean by like, you have to be curious about this art form beyond the shows that are popular on Broadway. So that's my main piece of advice. In my book, though, going back to like the 40s are Lerner and Lowe, Rodgers and Hart, all like the standards that are played at like old folks nursing homes, because I get paid to sing those at concerts. I get to audition when Encores is doing a show and they say, bring in a 40s up-tempo. I have that. And then I have sort of, you know, like all the Rodgers and Hammerstein era things. And then there's a bit of in the 60s and 70s, it's mostly pop rock because shows like Almost Famous and Beautiful exist. And those are shows that are about music from that era. So I have a ton of songs, pop songs from that era. And then I have my personal favorite era of music, which is the power anthems of the 80s and 90s. I know you haven't made your mind up yet, but I would never do you wrong. I've known it from the moment that we met. No doubt in my mind where you belong. Like everything from Secret Garden, everything from Titanic, everything from Ragtime, everything from Joseph. I love that music. It's not usually asked of me to sing in an audition, but when somebody wants a contemporary musical theater song, I will bring in a pop song and one of those, as opposed to singing She Used to Be Mine from Waitress, because we've all heard that song enough. But yeah, that's in my book. I have stuff from every era in my book because I kid you not, it is asked of me in every audition. It's usually decade specific or it's a pop song. Very rarely are they like, bring in a Jason Robert Brown song.
This is great. No, I would. Oh my gosh, I would pay so much money to hear you sing the Act 2 opening of Joseph the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat as the narrator. I love that song. Why are the words escaping me now?
Is it
Strange as it
Strange
seems?
as-
Yeah,
There's
strange
been
as it seems.
Just for that moment at the end, just for.
My dream role.
That-
It's my dream role.
Oh, is it really?
That and to play the daughter in Light in the Piazza when Kelly O'Hara is old enough to play the mom, but I don't know if she ever will because she seems to age in reverse.
Producing friends out there, we are going to secure this funding. That would be the easiest thing to raise.
You know, I
money
say
for.
that
Oh
like
my God.
every interview. Like I kind of believe in the power of manifestation, but I say it every interview when people say, "What's your dream role?" Because I think as long as I keep saying it enough, it will happen. Make it happen. I was like, it doesn't have to be anywhere fancy. We'll do it at 2 stands. I already know all the music. You don't have to rehearse me. Just ask Kelly if she can show up. She's too young to play the mom right now, but.
All right, we have a question from Sydney Green. She's asking about the transition from college to career. What was challenging about that transition, and how did you overcome those challenges?
Yeah, this is why I hate Wikipedia because it's like just our highlights.
You're right.
I want to create like an actor's Wikipedia where it's like, okay, let me tell you about the thing I went in for 20 times that I didn't get and they gave it to a TV star, which like they should. She was going to sell the show better than I was. So let's see. I was really lucky, and this is sort of a piece of advice if kids are considering going to school for musical theater, which is not a necessity. People are successful without that. But I really said, if I'm going to school for musical theater, I'm going to a school that has a successful showcase program. Because, and not just like a showcase where like, oh, maybe like 10 kids get to do it and like a couple people come. Like a showcase that people look forward to, show up to, people get response from. And so that was a big decision between if I was going to go to University of Michigan or go to, I got into Boston College and I was really interested in going to school there, but they did not have a showcase. So I went to University of Michigan. And that process, when I graduated, we did a showcase, which again, you can do those in New York without attending a BFA musical theater program. It makes it a bit easier, but you can. But I was really lucky. I got an agent out of that. And for 2 years, all I did was audition. I got my first like fancy equity job doing diner at Signature Theater in DC.
Of course, Kathleen Marshall.
Kathleen Marshall. And it was like huge. I remember getting it and I called my parents. I was like, this is it. It's going to Broadway. I was like, this is happening. And of course, it didn't. It like died out of town, which is what happens with a lot of out of town shows. But I remember I was the youngest person on that cast, and it was a cast of like 15 incredible people, like Whitney Basher, Josh Grizzetti, Matthew James Thomas, Derek Klena, Tess Soltow was in it. It was just and then Bryn O'Malley was in a later rendition of it. It was just a great group of people who had been in the business for upwards of like 5 or more years than I had been. And I soaked up everything from them. That's when I learned how to do my taxes. That's when I learned how to contribute to my 401k.
There's an area that I think theater programs can grow in, which is having transparent conversations with students about financial stability, how to budget, how to live in expensive cities, how to set up a 401k, how to do their taxes. I've never heard of a program doing it phenomenally. How did you learn about those things?
Yeah, nobody prepared me for how to be financially stable here. So that is my advice of like, whenever I work with an older actor, like, and I was really older. They weren't old at all. They'd just been in the business a bit longer than I had. I had so many questions for them. And I reached out to them about everything from who do I go to do my taxes? Who do I go to? How much should I contribute to my 401k on this contract? When I'm in like a LORT contract, what do I contribute to my agent versus what I would do on a production contract? And the thing is, like, I think schools are getting a bit better about teaching it now, but I will say for me, it was a lot of just asking questions of the people I was working with. And of course they knew because they had been doing it for longer. They figured it out on their own, just like I was.
What are some of the side jobs you've had over the years?
As I had 3 jobs when I moved to the city. I babysat, I dog walked, and I worked at a gym. And I auditioned a ton. I was able to make my mentality less about getting the job and more about making sure the audition got me the next audition.
Nice.
So and there are some people who like book a job as soon as they get out of school. I got a really cool regional job out of school, but more importantly than that, I got recognition from a casting office. And that casting office kept calling me in and kept calling me in, and they gave me my first, they recommended me to Les Mis when they were casting for Fontaine, which is a very interesting story because I was going in for Cosette, and I didn't get it. And a couple weeks later, they said, can she come in for Fontaine? And I kid you not, I called my mentor at the time because I was out of town doing diner, and I said, this is such a waste of my time. I'm too young for this. Like, I don't have enough money to buy the train ticket to go. I'm afraid I'm going to get back late and miss my show, and I can't miss a show. And she basically said, she was like, they called you for a reason. You have to go. And I went. And that was so
youngest actress to
yeah.
play Fontaine.
And also, and I feel comfortable talking about it now, if we're being honest about obstacles, I'm pretty sure I was fired from that show.
Interesting.
And I mean that not because nobody came in and fired me, but I was signed on for 8 months of that, and I was not renewed at the end, and a couple other people were. And I think I just had such a young, thick skin, and nothing had really gone wrong. Like, there had been no difficulties, no come to blows or whatever. But I was not signed on again to continue for the next 4 months or however long it continues to run after that. And in hindsight, I'm like, oh, of course you were fired. Like, but you weren't fired because you weren't good or because you weren't, they just wanted something else. And they took their opportunity to find it. At the time, I did not understand. I was like, oh, great, that's all I signed on for. I didn't realize that. And I think that's probably a good thing because in my head, I've been able to look at it exactly like you've said. I was like, it wasn't aligning for the next couple months. I was not their person for the next couple months, but I was their person for that time. Right. And after that, I didn't work for like a year and a half. Yeah. I did like 2 shows regionally. I did something at PCLO and I did something at the York Theater. and I got rejected from Anastasia at the very end, Frozen at the very end, Sweeney Todd Downtown at the very end. Those were the three big ones, and they came right in a row.
To some degree, everyone feels like the odds are stacked against them, right? Actors feel they have no control, they're chosen. Directors feel they have no control, the writer or producer chooses them. Playwrights feel like they have no control, a theater or a producer picks them. Producers feel like they don't have any control. Investors, a Broadway house, Tony Awards, all of those factors have to work together to choose the show for the show to work. So to some degree, everyone feels chosen, and they feel like they have some control, and then they lack control in other areas. You've been a part of successful musicals, shows that, as you've said, died out of town. What have you learned about all the different roles, and how has that helped you understand the role of acting amidst this huge community?
I think I learned a lot about, actors always think we're the victim of somebody else, but the more that you spend time with the process, the way that I spent with Meangirls, the more I realized that our producers, our creatives, were just as much at the victim of people higher than them, or opinions of audience members or opinions of critics. It's such a nebulous art form because there's no right. There's just what happens. I'm such a cog in a massive thing that is so much bigger than me, that when I think like, oh, nobody's on my side, or like I'm not getting what I need, or whatever, I think, right, because there's so much going on, and my job is to just show up and perform. And if I'm not okay with that being my job, then I need to leave. And like, I'm really lucky. I don't think people know if they can do 8 shows a week and just be an actor until they're actually forced to do it.
Yes.
And when people would stop me on the street and be like, oh my God, you've been there for a year and a half, how are you doing? I always felt really happy to say, like, I still love it. And it's not because I'm some like amazing, like I had bad days just like everybody else. That type of life worked for me, and that type of responsibility worked for me. And I think when you realize it doesn't is when you need to leave.
Let's talk about leaving, because the focus of arts education and training is always about booking the job, but something we don't prepare people for is knowing when to leave a job and how to do so strategically.
I mean, something Casey Nicola, when we were all deciding if we were going to stay on for another year, he said to his leading cast, he was like, if you feel like you don't want to stay, then you need to go, because it's only going to get worse. Like, it compounds on every month that you stay gets more difficult for you, to the point where no matter how talented your performance is on stage, if it's like eating away at your soul, it doesn't matter. You're not happy doing it.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of it, and I really admired, like, I worked really close with Taylor, who has been in the business much longer than I have, because she left school at age 19, 20. And she went on a really interesting journey. And I don't think she would be upset with me sharing this, but she just kind of realized, like, okay, I want to be the person in charge now. And she went through a lot of steps to reach that decision, and a lot of like inner grappling of like, but I have this amazing thing. Shouldn't I hold on to it for as long as possible? But just because it looks amazing to the outside, for her, it was not fulfilling anymore. So she left, and she started writing, she started producing, she started her own like theater company for kids. And I think leaving is a different journey for everybody, but I think it requires a lot of introspection and trust that if you leap, some type of net will appear. Because if you just stay because you're scared, I think you're setting yourself up for misery.
What did you learn working with Tina Fey?
It was really interesting to watch that the smartest person in the room didn't need to be the loudest. Like,
Right.
She would wait for things to come to her. She was always working on something in her mind, but she never like flexed her power in a bombastic way. And I think that's like, I learned something from watching that, because now when I see people who behave that way, I think like, that's not actually effective. That makes me not trust you as much, because if you think you need to be the loudest voice, you're compensating for maybe a lack of confidence or feeling like your ego is at play. And Tina just has no ego. She's so down to earth and was always the first person like willing to do a rewrite, like was constantly rewriting her jokes and everything. And I was really impressed by that, because she was the one person in the room who I think could have said like, this is it, bye, I'm leaving, it's perfect. And she stayed with us, you know, through year 2. She would still show up at the theater and she was doing rewrites for the tour. Like, she's a hard worker. I honestly think I respect her too much to like be buddy because and I'm not, it's a different thing of like somebody who's like, it's not an afraid thing of like, I bow to you. It's, I admire you so much and I'm so grateful for you. And because of that, like, I want respect to be the most important thing. And that's how I deal with people in positions that I believe are higher than me. Not everybody's like that, but I've just learned it must be like a teacher pleasing complex that I have, but that's just who I am. And I'm okay with that. I was like, there will be a day where I can like knock back some shots with the people who are employing me, but it's not right now.
I want to ask you about the relationship between director and leading lady. You've been a lead role many times on Broadway, off Broadway, on out-of-town tryouts. What is that relationship like, and how does it differ from director to director?
You know, it's really interesting. Like, I've worked with intimately with like 4 very different directors. I worked with Kathleen Marshall, who was very like warm and empathetic in the rehearsal room and then would like go her own way. I worked with Casey and Tina, who were like easy to work with in the room and definitely could hang and loved to have a good time when it was work related, but then had their own lives. And then just recently I worked with James Lapine, who was like of sort of like the old school world where like your cast is your family, and he really got to know everybody's significant others and really wanted to check in with us about our daily lives. And that was something that I had not experienced, but he still did it in the way where like he cared about you, he cared about your interpersonal life, but at the end of the day, we're there to work.
If you could effectively communicate one idea to put out into the world, what would it be?
I think it's that artists have a civic responsibility as much as an artistic responsibility. And I didn't realize it until I was working on Meangirls, and I realized how many young people were watching our show and watching us personally. And I just thought, it doesn't mean that we have to be perfect. It doesn't mean that we have to like Mother Teresa every day. You can have your bad days, you can have your dark edges and sharp edges, but that when you are put on a platform that's visible, you have to acknowledge it and you have to cultivate it and utilize it for something bigger than your own personal gain. And I think that's hard sometimes when you're in the doldrums of your career and you're like, I'm just trying to get a job. I'm just trying to make ends meet. I'm trying to make ends meet. But when you make ends meet and you're sitting in a time of maybe surplus, then you have to use that surplus for something besides yourself. And I was in a surplus during Meangirls, and I really took advantage of what I did with that. I was in a surplus. I had a good job. I had a job people liked, and I had a steady job. And I thought, great, now is the time for me to do more than just be an actor, but to set an example. So, and that means different things for different people. And it doesn't have to be on a massive global scale. It can be just within your tiny community of friends or the artists that you're working with in the cast. But I think that's sort of what I hope to leave behind. And I'm in a phase right now where I don't really know what's going to happen as we go through this. And I'm letting myself sort of sit with that uncertainty and figure out, you know, if our business is in peril for the long term, how do I not panic and not make this about me, and how can I figure out a way to make it about our community and rebuilding the community, because we're all gonna be in it together.
Right.
And I don't know, maybe things will turn around, but I think that's what I would like to leave for. That sounds so crazy. So I'm like, I'm hopefully not going anywhere, but that is sort of how I want to continue to work in this field. To when I have the bandwidth to use it for something besides promoting myself.
Erika Henningsen, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your insight, your talent from Discovering Broadway. This is Joel Kirk. Thanks for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next time.